Hey guys, I'm back with a new video. In this video, let us learn about how we can query elements in a DOM. So the topic for this video is querying elements in DOM. Okay, so querying elements on nodes, I will use these terms interchangeably, though we'll come back to the differences between them a bit later. Now if you want to query the content on your rendered HTML page, JavaScript provides us with a couple of methods which you can use on the document object, about which we learned in the previous video. Most importantly, we have two methods, querySelector and getElementById. getElementById. Now these methods select one element at a time. You also have other methods like getElementsByTagName, getElementsByTagName, and then you have another method called as querySelectorAll, querySelector, and then we have all. So these two are used to select multiple elements, and they will return us something called as an HTML collection or NodeList, which are similar to arrays, but they do not possess all the properties of an array. They're somewhat similar to arrays, but they have not all the specific properties of array, but they do have some behavior of array. So they select specific elements, multiple elements. And now we have querySelector. So let us discuss about querySelector. It can take a CSS selector, so it takes CSS selector, okay, so CSS selector or an ID, and it gives you the power and flexibility to basically select elements with complex query in your DOM. Now we have the getElementById. Now it takes an ID. You will pass an ID as a parameter to the getElementById method that is defined on the document object, which you assign to some HTML element. The ID pertaining to some element, you can pass this ID to the getElementById method, and then you can selectively select that element from the DOM using its ID. So that means using the ID of the element, you can select the element from the DOM. So suppose this is your HTML DOM, and there is some element defined here that has an ID of say G only, has G. So you will basically pass G here, and then you can reach out to this element. You can grab this element from the DOM. You will have a reference to this element. You can store this in some variable and then later use it in your code. So moving on, from this you can select the element from the DOM, and since ID is unique within one web page, this is a method that will return only one element. So the above two methods, querySelector and getElementById, will return only one element. getElementsByTagName, querySelectorAll, and various other methods, they will select multiple elements from the DOM. Now coming back to querySelector, it takes any CSS selector, and therefore it might be a selector that matches multiple elements. But in this case, if you're trying to match multiple elements, the querySelector method will always give you access to the first matched element on the page. So it gives you access to the first matched element on the page. Okay, so it gives you access to the very first element that gets matched from a bunch of elements. If you are getting bunch of matched elements, then it will only select the first match element on the page. Now both of these methods, querySelector and getElementById, will give you a direct reference to the DOM element. Now let us move on further to querySelectorAll and getElementsByTagName. Now these are methods that I told you. They generally give you collection of elements. Okay, so these two methods give you collection of elements. Collection of elements. And they are array-like objects. Those collections that we get, they are array-like objects, generally of two types. We have a node list and we have a HTML collection. So it is not a real array, but it behaves a bit like an array. To be precise, here also you have different ways of querying the elements: by CSS selector, by tag name, by CSS class as well. So the ways to query are CSS selector, or say class. We have a method called as getElementsByTagName. So we can select by tags, and we can querySelectorAll. So if you pass, say you want all the paragraphs from your HTML DOM, so we have a bunch of p tags, say. So if we want all the p tags, we can use this querySelectorAll method, and this will return all the p tags in form of a node list. So I'll discuss that. So this is how querySelectorAll works. So it basically is taking a CSS selector as the query selector, but unlike querySelector, it does not return the first element which it matched, but all the elements that match the selector. Now getElementsByTagName, it will give you all the elements that have a HTML tag, and then there are other selectors to select by class name or by, say, the name attribute that you assign to, say, elements like input fields. querySelectorAll is the most flexible of all, because with it you have the power to select anything you want by CSS selectors. Now moving on, one key point I would like to mention is that querySelectorAll will give you a snapshot of the currently rendered DOM. So let me make up some space and discuss more about querySelectorAll. querySelectorAll. Now this will give you a snapshot of the currently rendered DOM. Snapshot of currently rendered DOM. What do we mean by snapshot of currently rendered DOM? This gives you a non-living node list. So you can say a non-live node list. So you get a node list, as I discussed. And then we have getElementsByTagName. So getElementsByTagName. So getElementsByTagName returns us a node list, and whenever you create or delete elements, so it will be reflected in the data, which is unlike in case of querySelectorAll. Now moving further, let us discuss about nodes and elements. So nodes and elements. So what are nodes? Nodes are objects that make up the DOM. So objects that make up your HTML DOM, that make up the DOM. And everything in DOM is a node. So whenever your DOM gets rendered, any element that you see is basically a node in your node tree. Now HTML tags are just element nodes, as I just examined in the previous video, where we saw a structure of HTML page, and we discussed that all the tags that we have rendered there, they are element nodes. Then we have something called as the text nodes, which we also discussed in the previous video, which are not really meant that important, but they are very important to know as well. So attributes create attribute nodes. Now moving on, elements are also one type of elements. They are also one type of nodes that are just created from the HTML tags. Okay, so they are created from your HTML tags that you basically write in your markup. So created from HTML tags that basically get rendered, not the text in there. Now why is it important to understand the difference? Because on the elements you have special properties and methods using which you can interact with various elements, you can change their content, you can change their style and more. Now these available methods and properties then depend on the kind of element that you are working with. So for example, you have an input in which you are asking the user to enter some content. Say you are asking the user to enter an email, and then you have various ways for reading that input. So whatever user writes in the input box, you can fetch that input. So, and then you can work with it, you can manipulate it. So in the next video, we'll learn about different methods that give access to different elements. You can also create and remove them with the help of JavaScript. In the next video, we'll try out these query methods to get to know how they work. So if you're loving the content, do subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys in the very next video. Thanks a lot, guys.